Following the innovation and revolution of public broadcasting media such as television and public radio and newspaper, there were a lot of events in human history that were able to benefit both positively and negatively from this innovation. More specifically, we are focusing on the 1960s, and in my part, I will be focusing on the civil rights movement. I surmise that the civil rights movement was actually able to benefit from public broadcasting media and able to reach its full potential because of the platforms that it provided African Americans as well as the movement, and able to give them access to meaningful legislation and politicians who were able to make that happen, as well as grow the movement. Now, the 1960s, for the first time in human history, Americans were able to get home from work, sit down on the couch, and actually turn on the TV or the radio and get a vision or a sneak peek of what life was like all around the country, or even downtown at the center of their cities. Now, Americans were able to, as I said, get a sneak peek or preview and see the harsh conditions that African Americans had to endure, such as police dogs being unleashed on them, such as water hoses, and being beaten brutally by police officers in the streets whenever they were trying to peacefully protest, as well as bystanders who would throw their milkshakes or drinks or throw their trash or garbage all over them as if they were second-class citizens. One of my sources, NPR, actually did a review of the summer of 1963, in which a reporter got to interview a young kid from the Birmingham neighborhood who grew up to be an investigative journalist. Whenever he was being interviewed, the interviewer was able to gather from the young gentleman that there was actually an effort to cover up the civil rights movement in Birmingham. There was a joint effort by several newspaper sources to not put any of the events that were going on in the civil rights movement on the front page of the paper, instead opting to cover it up or not let it get as much media's attention as it should have. But with the cover-ups and scandals of public broadcasting media, there was also some positives to be gained from the actual innovation of the technology. With this innovation of technology, social leaders, church leaders, people who were leading the actual protests were now able to use the platform for their benefit, and were able to reach out to the communities in order to advertise public meetings, community meetings, in order to garnish support for the movement. More specifically, I would like to cite Martin Luther King, who gave his infamous "I Have a King" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Now, this was following a protest in which they marched up to Washington, D.C. in order to protest for more jobs. Now, with the release and delivery of this speech, Martin Luther King was able to open up the hearts and minds of the politicians of Washington, D.C., and allow them to finally consider meaningful legislation. Following the delivery of Martin Luther King's infamous "I Have a Dream" speech, he was able to have meaningful meetings and conversations with the then President JFK. Unfortunately, after the assassination of JFK, President Lyndon Johnson took office and then opted to honor the promise of his former president and took on the case or championed the civil rights movement. Now, with this meaningful political support, they were able to create meaningful political legislation that was able to push for racial equity. With this racial equity came the Civil Rights Act of 1964. With the Civil Rights Act of 1964, African Americans were no longer allowed to be discriminated against, and not only African Americans, but all people based on age, color, sex, religious views were able to be discriminated against. So in previous open establishments where there was allowed to be a colored section, such as lunch counters, buses, public restrooms, they were no longer allowed to be. This even caused ripples in the Brown versus Board of Education Act, or Supreme Court case, which allowed discrimination but was no longer allowed once this was codified into law. Another interesting piece of legislation that came out of this was the Voting Rights Act, as well as the Fair Housing Act, infamously known as the Civil Rights Act of 1968. These acts allowed for non-discrimination in housing or in voting. So this allowed people of color to actually participate in day-to-day activities and actually exercise their full political rights. Now, with all these issues that came forth, there was a lot of good that came from public broadcasting media, and that it allowed these civil rights leaders to fully exercise their voices and garner support all over the country in order to get these political pieces of legislation that helped push racial equity. Although there was a lot of martyrs for the cause and there was a lot of injustices that happened, there was a push and final precedent for freedom and religious freedom, as well as political freedom that allowed people today to enjoy these liberties that we have. Okay. So here are my sticky notes.